what it was like to be rich in every time period. Number 5. Ancient Egypt's pay-to-win afterlife. Imagine retirement planning, but instead of worrying about golf memberships and cholesterol, you're hoarding gold-plated trinkets to bribe the gods. That's basically what being rich in ancient Egypt was like. Your entire life was prep work for your eternal side hustle, not dying again. And trust me, it was expensive. Pharaohs and wealthy elites spent decades building tombs that were basically the ancient version of luxury condos, except the neighbors were all dead, and instead of HOA fees, you were paying for spells, charms, and jars of your own organs. The rich decked themselves out with gold masks, elaborate coffins, and even model boats, so they could cruise across the cosmic river in style. Meanwhile, the poor, a shallow grave, maybe a cheap amulet, and a whole lot of wishful thinking. Basically, ancient Egypt was the birthplace of freemium gaming. If you didn't cough up real-world cash, good luck unlocking the premium afterlife content. And here's the kicker. Even if you did spend a fortune preparing for eternity, you still weren't safe. Tomb raiders were everywhere. Imagine saving for retirement your whole life, only for someone to break into your 401 Kelvin and use it to buy beer. That's what happened, except the beer was jewelry, mummified pets, and whatever wasn't nailed down. So yeah, being rich in Egypt meant luxury, but also the constant anxiety of becoming an ancient yard sale. Number 4. Ancient Rome's wine and vomit cycle. Now picture this. You're at a dinner party, sipping wine that's basically stronger than modern tequila, and someone politely excuses themselves to go vomit so they can come back and eat more. Welcome to being rich in Rome, where wealth meant feasting so hard your stomach had to file a restraining order. The Roman elite lived for banquets. We're talking courses upon courses of exotic foods, flamingo tongues, honey-soaked dormice, oysters by the bucket. And when they got full, no problem. They had something called a vomitorium. Spoiler alert, it wasn't a special puke room, despite the name. But the myth persists because honestly, it fits too well. Romans actually just excused themselves, got rid of the evidence, and then dove back in. Their motto might as well have been, why stop when you can just eject? And of course, being rich also meant you weren't pouring your own wine. You had slaves for that. You weren't cooking slaves again. You weren't cleaning, guess who? If you were wealthy in Rome, your biggest responsibility was deciding whether you wanted your grapes peeled or unpeeled. Meanwhile, the poor were outside eating stale bread, watered-down wine, and pretending roasted rats counted as protein. So, yeah, Roman wealth basically came down to binge eating, like it was an Olympic sport, and flaunting your power by outsourcing literally everything, even digestion. Honestly, DoorDash has nothing on Roman aristocrats. Number 3. Medieval nobles in hygiene theater. Fast forward to medieval Europe, where being rich didn't necessarily mean being clean. Imagine walking into a castle and being hit with a combined smell of wet hay, burning candles, and 20 unwashed humans all marinating in wool. That was luxury living. Medieval nobles flexed their wealth with castles, silk clothes, and feasts, but their hygiene? Questionable at best. Baths were rare, perfume was heavy, and lice were basically live-in roommates. Yet, ironically, nobles were still considered cleaner than peasants because they could afford scented oils, imported soaps, and servants to do the scrubbing. Think of it as hygiene theater. They weren't actually clean, but they smelled slightly less like livestock, which was enough to count as glamorous. Food-wise, nobles dined on roasted meats, exotic spices from the Silk Road, and bread so white it looked like it had been bleached. Peasants, meanwhile, were chewing on dark rye and hoping their soup had something floating in it. Rich medieval lords even had entire teams of musicians and jesters to keep them entertained while eating. You just had to worry about not spilling soup on your one set of clothes. Oh, and dentistry? Forget it. Rich or poor, your teeth were wrecked, but nobles could afford gold caps and fancy dental bling. Basically, Medieval wealth was the Instagram filter of history. Glamorous on the surface, but underneath, still kind of gross. Number 2. Renaissance flex culture. Imagine walking into your friend's house and every single wall is covered in art. Not posters, not IKEA prints, actual frescoes painted by dudes with names like Leonardo, Raphael, and Michelangelo. That was Renaissance rich people energy, turning your home into an art museum just to prove you could. Wealthy families, like the Medici in Florence, basically invented the concept of flexing on the poor through patronage. They paid artists, architects, and philosophers not just because they loved beauty, but because art was the ultimate status symbol. Forget a Lamborghini if you were rich in the Renaissance. You hired Botticelli to immortalize your cousin as Venus in a seashell. Talk about overkill. And it wasn't just about art. Rich folks also staged extravagant banquets that made Roman feasts look tame. We're talking about entire roasted peacocks reassembled with their feathers to look majestic on the table. Food wasn't just dinner, it was performance art. Picture Instagram, food influencers, but in 1500 and with significantly more swan meat. Meanwhile, the poor were out there surviving on bread, beans, and the occasional onion if they were lucky. But hey, at least they didn't have to deal with the existential pressure of being a Medici, knowing that if you didn't fund enough art, people might forget your name in 500 years. Spoiler alert, they didn't. So yeah, Renaissance wealth was basically a non-stop game of cultural one-upmanship. Who has the best art, the fanciest feast, the most extra-ceiling fresco? Answer: whoever had the deepest pockets and the patience to sit for 6-hour portrait sessions. Number 1. The Industrial Age, Downton Abbey lifestyle. Now we arrive at the 19th century, where being rich meant living in a mansion so large you could get lost in your own hallway. Think of it as the golden era of having too many rooms and not enough emotional stability. The wealthy of the industrial age loved showing off their money with sprawling estates, lavish carriages, and enough servants to staff a small village. If you were rich, you didn't know how to cook, clean, or maybe even dress yourself, because that was all outsourced. Your job was to sit in parlors, throw elaborate balls, and worry about whether your neighbor's chandelier was bigger than yours. But here's the twist. Industrial wealth didn't just mean aristocrats anymore. Factory owners, railroad tycoons, and oil barons joined the game. Suddenly, you didn't have to be born noble. You just had to invent something like mass steel production, and boom, instant mansion. Daily life included endless tea times, promenades in carefully manicured gardens, and sitting for portraits where everyone looked vaguely constipated. Seriously, those paintings never smile. Meanwhile, the poor were crammed into smoky cities, working 14-hour shifts and eating whatever bread wasn't moldy. So yeah, being rich in the industrial age meant living like a permanent guest at a fancy hotel, complete with staff, chandeliers, and the occasional scandal. It was basically Downton Abbey, except real life, and with way more coal dust floating in the background. That's all for today. I'll be making similar videos in the future. Subscribe to see them.